Hello, I am Lauren Bocci, and I am so honored to be able to welcome you to this podcast. Today, we are focused on Gen Z and Gen Alpha, really talking about adolescence, adolescent culture, relationships, and what we need to know to be the best friends we can be to this generation. And so, with that, we have three experts that I'd like to bring up right now. I'm going to start by bringing up Dr. Arthur Satterwhite, Dr. Kara Powell, and Dr. Tanita Maddox.
Hey, Young Life family, how's it going? You're all excited to be here. We are excited to have you here to join us, as Lauren said, for this wonderful conversation on Gen Z, all things Gen Z, practical realities and applications for us as a mission and for the broader church community. I have the esteemed privilege of sitting down with two friends, two of my favorite people, Dr. Kara Powell and Dr. Tanita Maddox. I'm going to introduce them real quick, maybe give us a few ground rules, and then we are going to jump right in. Does that work? To get a little more energy. I'm Baptist, y'all. I need y'all to talk back to me, okay? All right. So, Dr. Kara Powell. Dr. Kara Powell is the Chief of Leadership Formation at Fuller and the Executive Director of Fuller Youth Institute. She has completed her PhD in Practical Theology from Fuller Seminary, as well as an MDiv from Bethel. She was named by Christianity Today as one of the 50 women to watch. She has written several books and articles, the latest being 3 Big Questions. She'll talk a little bit more about that. I highly encourage all of us to go out and get it if you haven't already. And what I love about Kara, she was just sharing a story the other day, just a fun fact that was fun for me. For you college football people out there, her daughter was just on the Rose Court at the Rose Bowl this past weekend. Unfortunately, my Buckeyes were not playing, but we will see the Wolverines tomorrow. You can find it online. Check out the article. She's another Young Life kid, so she's one of us. Dr. Tanita Maddox is definitely one of us. She's on our staff. Oh, one real quick fact also about Kara. She was also a wildlife leader. So again,
in college, I was on student staff.
So she has served, is serving, continues to serve us in many ways on our theological council, part of our research and everything. So thank you, Kara.
My pleasure.
Dr. Tanita Maddox is the Associate Regional Director out in the Northwest, in the Mountain West region. She sent me her bio here again. She's a second-generation Young Life kid. And then now serves as a leader and associate regional director there in the Mountain West region. She lives in Spokane, did I say that right? Mm-hmm. Washington, with her husband of 18 years, Ashley, who's also on staff.
No.
Serves in a lot of ways, helps out. She has 2 little boys. She's completed her Master's of Christian Leadership from Fuller Theological, as well as a Doctorate of Ministry at Phoenix Seminary. And her doctoral thesis for this conversation was in sharing the gospel with Generation Z. Fun fact about her daughter is actually turning 6, or youngest is turning 6 tomorrow.
My son is turning 6 tomorrow, yes.
And she recently started an Insta account called This YL Staff Mom. That's a community of women on staff across the mission figuring out how to be moms and serve this mission together. Can we welcome them, please? Awesome. Let's just jump straight in. So for this first conversation, as we're talking about Gen Z, who are they and what are they asking? You both have done significant research, written articles, books, are being called on to not only speak to our staff, but in many rooms as well. One of the things that's come up a lot is, man, how do we just talk to this generation? How do we break through? There's memes all over the internet around like their language. I still don't know what cat means, so I'm just going to be honest. I'm 40. I'm a millennial. I'm out the loop. But we'd love to hear from you. How do we talk to adults, this generation as adults, and what makes this generation unique, different from other generations prior? Maybe Tanita, would you start us off?
Yeah, so are you asking how do we talk to adults about kids?
Correct.
Okay. So we do a lot of this in Young Life, right? And so when I think about when I'm talking to donors or I'm speaking at a banquet or working with a committee and I have a very small window to share about what's happening with kids, that if I can say, okay, I could do all the research and do all the experiences and everything, but if I could narrow it down, if I had 30 seconds, I would say there's three major experiences that this group of young people have grown up with that are foreign to most of us in the room. And that is social media. It didn't exist when I was in high school and all the things that come along with that. No one had ever brought a gun onto a campus and started shooting until I was in college. Most of our kids have some kind of level of anxiety that it will happen at their campus. My own small children have lockdown drills and active shooter drills, right, in their elementary school, and we're actively watching that on the news. And that's a reality that didn't exist when we were kids, as well as a global pandemic took place during their development that didn't exist. So just add those three things together, and we have a realm of understanding that we're missing out on for young people. So I like to share that, and then I always say we need to share hope on behalf of the next generation. So however you have hope for the next generation, share that with your donors, your banquet, with your committee, with your leaders. They are truth seekers. They are incredibly creative. They're intuitive and sensitive. They are seeing the world through a different lens and have different answers to the problems that we are seeing. And they are poised to change the world in a way that no other generation has been poised to.
That's so good. And Kara, I know you've been looking into, you talked about the answers they're getting and questions that they have. You've done some research and writing on those specific questions. Can you maybe share a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to. So at the Fuller Youth Institute at Fuller Seminary, where I'm a faculty member and a leader, what we do is we turn research into resources. So we love trying to figure out what are the tough questions that leaders like you are trying to figure out, and then how do we turn that into a practical resource? So we tried to figure out, what are the big questions that this generation is asking? And we did deep interviews as well as kind of broad surveys. And we landed on three, just like you three. So we're very Trinitarian here, apparently, on the platform today. So we landed on three. And these three questions have changed actually how I understand people in general and myself. Because those three questions are, first of all, identity, who am I? And then secondly, belonging, where do I fit? And thirdly, purpose, what difference can I make? So identity, belonging, and purpose. And all of us are wrestling with those questions. How many of you in the room are 30 or under? Raise your hand if you're 30 or under. Awesome. Yeah. I mean, Ken, when you said you've been on staff for Young Life, much of the room is not even 50 years old, and you've been on staff for 50 years, which is awesome. But for those of you under 30, these questions are often at a rolling boil. For those of us who are a little bit older, we're still dealing with these questions, but they're more at a low simmer. And so for our young people, when I think about young people, I'm always trying to figure out what are they really wrestling with? And when they're doing something or saying something that just feels a little interesting, feels a little bit different than what I know to be true about them or how they normally act, or just when they're kind of being their full crazy selves, are they trying to find a sense of identity? Are they trying to find a sense of belonging? Or are they trying to find a sense of purpose? And even for myself, Arthur, I mean, if I'm honest, I wrestle with those questions too. And who am I? Where do I fit? What difference can I make? And those are often God's biggest growth areas for me too. So I've just come to really appreciate and better understand this generation that, is dealing with guns, is dealing with social media, and like all of us has dealt with the pandemic. And how is that affecting their identity, belonging, and purpose quest? One last thing. The good news is Jesus offers the best answers to those questions. Amen? Amen. And so that's what we get to offer young people, is Jesus's best answers to those really core questions.
That's good. I mean, and I think what both of you are getting at is this generation is uniquely engaging and being confronted with different realities than previous generations, even us as millennials. I remember before the cell phone. I remember dial-up. I still remember AOL. AOL's gone, right? I think so. So, I mean, even just in the midst of that, social media, right? There's got to be implications of social media on, who this generation is, what questions they're asking, what they're feeling. But either of you want to just talk to us about that? What role is social media playing? What are you seeing in your research or your conversations?
Oh, nothing. Social media has had no impact on any of our lives, I don't think. No?
We can move on. Okay.
I mean, because I feel bad about myself when I go into social media. Social media, I like to see there's nothing necessarily moral about technology, right? Like, but it's something that we steward. We have to learn how to have a healthy relationship with it. And so we got to figure out what's our relationship with it? What's it doing to us? How are we interacting with the world? We didn't know that when it came out. And so we've had an entire generation of folks that have grown up with it when we didn't know what the impact was. So I can only imagine what it's like to be coming of age and be 14 or 15 years old and having a platform where I can compare myself to everyone my age around the world. As well as, and I've done this to myself even recently, where I made myself up. I was going out on a date night with my husband, and I don't know why, I searched for filters on my Instagram. And hundreds came up that changed how I looked. And I felt good about myself about 2 seconds before I did that. And then I was told by my technology, you do not look the way you're supposed to look. So I think that one of the difference with social media is it's coming for our adolescents. It's not like me going to buy a 17 magazine when I was 16 years old and then opening it and then feeling bad about myself. It is coming for them. It's a system that they live in. There's a lot of communication and community and culture that exists in that space. But you imagine that when you're being fed constant images of excelling and elite peers, we're being told there's a way you're supposed to look, there's a way you're supposed to act. The constant message that our kids are being told all the time through our social media is you're not enough. There's always something more. You should be something more, you should have something more, but you, as you are right now, aren't enough to be loved or to be valued is what I would throw on the end of that.
And it does feel like sometimes the media, the articles, the studies, it's telling us all about what's wrong with this generation, how disruptive they are, but they have gifts too. Carrie, I mean, you've talked about that, you've written about it. Maybe could you share with us, what are some of the gifts that you're seeing in this generation right now that, especially as we think about having conversations with adults, are places that can help us change the conversation?
Yeah. Well, I'm on one of the research committees for the Relate, that's what we're calling it now, Relate study, that Lauren mentioned. And I want to talk about how young people describe themselves, because I love and I resonate with how young people are describing themselves. 2 words that they're using quite a bit in that study to describe themselves are good and kind. And this generation is a generation that cares about others, that wants to make a difference. They care about all sorts of social justice issues. I was talking to somebody today, actually, who run here at 1YL, who runs an environmental agency, basically. And she said that, teenagers, and maybe you probably see this with the teenagers that you spend time with, they're like ahead of adults in their sensitivity to climate. They show up and they don't want the styrofoam cups, and we're used to the styrofoam cups, some of us. And so, this generation, like the way back to identity, belonging, and purpose, the way that they are purposeful, they want to make a difference in their world. I think it's one of the big gifts of this generation. And I think a question for us as we think about coming alongside, or as our Catholic friends would say, accompanying young people in the midst of their journey, I think, how can we understand what this generation and individual young people are most passionate about and support that? So for young people who are really into climate care, how do we walk alongside them and support that? For young people who are really into preventing sex trafficking, how do we walk alongside them and support that? So I think this is actually a gift that this generation is giving all of us, is this mindfulness of those who are excluded and this heart to really make a difference in our world.
I love what you were saying about that too, Kara, because it's not changing our kids, right? It's not like you should be different than who you are. Yeah. It's paying attention to how are they actively reflecting the image of God, the kingdom of heaven here on earth, that we can encourage and draw out and fan that flame, even because it's going to be different than the way we do.
Which is, I think, where actually social media is often a plus. I totally agree with you. I mean, I can't check social media on Friday or Saturday nights myself, because I go online and I see like everybody else seems to be having a better life than I am on Friday or Saturday night, and I'm having leftovers and in my sweats with my husband watching Netflix. And so, I mean, that creates insecurity in me, which sometimes actually sounds like a great night, I got to be honest. But that creates exactly what you're saying. I mean, if we're dealing with insecurity, so there certainly are some downsides. And I think social media exposes young people to the needs in the world and how they can make a difference. I mean, we saw this in 2020 with George Floyd. Like, young people were so on top of what was happening in our culture. They were leading the way. So much of the protests and march and justice movement was done by young people who coordinated on social media, et cetera. So young people's a tool. Social media is a tool. We need to be mindful of it. And there's a lot of good that technology can do too.
So good, so good. Looking at what you have sent in, right now the number one question is just, who is Gen Alpha? Who are these A's that are out there? Which, again, we understand that there's varying ranges. Tanita, do you want to just share a little bit about who is Gen Alpha for us?
Yeah, and Karen and I were talking about this a little bit before, because generational study in markers for this, like, it's a little art and science kind of combined. So right now, there's 2 major years that have surfaced as the start of Gen Alpha in the conversation that's happening. One is 2010. That comes from Mark McCrindle and the McCrindle Research Institute out of Australia. His theory is that every generation since the boomers is 15 years long, no matter any events or circumstances. So they just did math and just came out with 2010. Dr. Jing Twenge out of California, she would say that Gen Alpha starts at 2013. Her theory is based on that technology guides and marks generational shifts, because technology impacts how we live, how we relate to each other, how we relate to the world, how we understand ourselves. And so she said that's more of a classical generational ideas. Technology is the marker, and so she would put it as 2013. And if you ask me, I'd say I'm not racing to find this, right? It will come out as they get older and we learn more, and there's just not the same body of research out there for this age group coming up as the previous one. So we'll just be a little patient, because in the end, if someone said, what do you really think? I'd say, I don't know.
But either way, I mean, 2010 or 2013, we're talking about 10, 11, 12, 13, 14-year-olds and younger now. So that's helpful. Thanks, Tanita.
That's good. And maybe just a little more context. Like, if you think about a generation writ large, it's really like, what is that group of people that in that same period of time have shared experience, shared understanding. They've been influenced and informed by the same things. And that's why it can be a little fuzzy sometimes between generations.
I like to say, if you're reading about Gen Alpha, pay attention to the verb tense. Are they saying past tense? Like, child obesity has risen. Like, that's already happened. And we know that, and we can ask questions and look into that. If they're saying future tense, Gen Alpha will be like this, then we're predicting something that we actually don't know quite yet.
Maybe, Tanita, this next one, I think you're probably best suited to answer, because I've heard you answer this. The question is, how do our club talk progressions need to shift, if at all, in order to best serve Gen Z and maybe Gen Alpha?
So as far as the actual club talk sequence, the progression, that doesn't need to change. The gospel is the gospel. Who is Jesus? What is sin? What does the cross mean? What does the resurrection mean? And how am I supposed to respond to that? That should not change. That is what we do. Now, we all work with different populations of kids, different age groups of kids, who are all experiencing different things and asking different questions about who God is and who they are. And I always say that the best, when someone says, how do I get better club talks? I say, go do contact work. Know your kids. Know what they're asking. Because when you start to hear similar themes, like if we tackled that question earlier, am I enough? You said, I can write a club talk. The answer is who Jesus is, who God is, and I can answer that question for you straight from the interactions that Jesus had with others in the gospel. So I focus more on what are the questions kids are asking, how do I answer that with our gospel sequence.
So good. This last question for this section, I think, is going to be a good segue to the next segment. And Karen, I want to come to you. The question is, what is the greatest relational need for both generations? So as we think about Gen Z, Gen Alpha, what we know about them, what are the different relational needs?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Tanita just said we need to be cautious with what we say about Gen Alpha, right? Can I revise the question a bit? As a researcher, I get a little uncomfortable with what is the greatest. That's just really hard for me to answer. I can answer what is a great relational need. So if we can tweak the question that way, what is a great relational need? I think something that is generating more and more interest in parents and leaders like you all is the need to rebuild or maybe build trust with this generation of young people. This is a generation that has lost, both of them, Gen Z and Alpha, young people in general, they have lost trust with institutions. They have lost trust with adults. They have lost trust with church, and I mean church including faith community in general. And sadly, we in the faith community, we have earned that lack of trust, if that makes sense. Especially, I'll speak more in the U.S. That's more my primary focus on research, especially in the last say 6, 7, 8 years. And so I think that's a big task ahead of us as adults who care about young people, is building or rebuilding trust with them. And Young Life, I mean, you all do this so well. So you are some of our world's experts in this. So keep doing what you're doing, and let's figure out together how to rebuild trust.
Let's talk about those relationships, and especially the stressors. Again, as a community that's actively in the lives of young people, knowing what they're facing, what's stressing them, can help us better connect and engage with. So, Kara, let me maybe come to you first, because I've heard you tell some good stories. You actually tell some good stories in your book. They're talking about how can older adults foster better relationships with Gen Z? What does that look like?
Yeah. Can I go deeper on building trust?
Please.
Okay. I'd love to go deeper on building trust, because I just think this is so key. Because this generation is more likely to trust influencers than they are institutions. And according to Springtide Research Institute, that's a fantastic research center that if you're not following them already, I'd encourage you to do so. They study faith of 13 to 25-year-olds here in the U.S. According to their research, a 13 to 25-year-old is twice as likely to say they've been hurt by organized religion as trust organized religion. So again, we have our work cut out for us. Here's the good news when it comes to rebuilding trust is not built through heroic grand gestures. It's built through everyday acts of love, of consistency, of doing what we say we're going to do, of showing up in young people's lives. And for some recent research we've done called Faith Beyond Youth Group, we actually studied how adults were building trust. And I need to tell you about a 71-year-old who has done phenomenally building trust with young people in a church context, in his faith community. His nickname is Slick, and he's given me permission to share his name. His nickname is Slick. And when we interviewed him, because we heard what a great job he did building trust with young people, I captured some of the quotes here. He said this: "I like to think that if Jesus walked the earth today, he'd spend a lot of time at 7th grade tennis matches." Sounds like a Young Life leader, huh? And then here's the 71-year-old, and this is his wording. He understands just how important it is to stay unconditionally invested in a young person's life. He says, when you get ghosted by the kids, this is him using the term ghosted. When you get ghosted by the kids, you can never ghost them back. When a kid ghosts me, there's usually a reason behind it. That kid is hurting and needs to know I still care. So Slick is showing up. Now, Slick did do something that was a little bit more noteworthy than showing up at 7th grade tennis matches. During the pandemic, he was working with middle schoolers. And the church's tradition was when the middle school ministry ended, they walked across the street to McDonald's every Wednesday night and hung out at McDonald's, and parents picked up at McDonald's. Well, pandemic hits, McDonald's closes, they have nowhere to go. The church starts meeting again, they have nowhere to go. Well, Slick, once McDonald's drive-thru opened, Slick bought a used limousine so he could fill it with middle schoolers in the back seats, drive them through the McDonald's drive-thru, and give them a little bit of relational time and time with him and another adult leader or two. So, because he understands the importance of consistency, of showing up, of not ghosting kids. So one last thing, Lisa Damour, who's a fantastic researcher. She's just one of my favorites, Damour. She's done a lot of work with girls, but what she says relates to boys too. She has this phrase about, and I think to me it's all about unconditional support and love. She talks about being a wall for young people, being a wall. And she says, young people, as they're experimenting, and for those of us who are parents, step-parents, guardians, grandparents, as they're individuating or separating themselves from us, they're going to move away from us. I grew up swimming, so I think about a swimming pool wall. They're going to kick away from us. And what Lisa D'Amour says is as adults, we just continue to be that unmoving wall. Because when they kick away from us, sometimes we feel a little dented, bruised, a little cracked. They move away. Eventually, they'll probably want to come back to us. They almost always want to come back. And if we haven't moved, if we've been that immovable wall, if we don't retreat, if we stay or lean in, then they have an easier time coming back to us. So to me, that's all about trust and being that kind of unflappable support for young people.
Can I build off of that too? Yeah, because I like to say, what I say to folks is we have to be the resilient ones.
Yeah.
People often say, how do we make resilient? How do we make this next generation resilient? I said, no, we have to be the resilient ones.
Yeah.
We go when we're rejected. We go when we've been ghosted. We invite again when we have had no response, which is the same as being that wall.
But isn't that, I mean, let's get honest, that's hard though. Like,
oh yeah.
I mean, when I was on Young Life student staff and would show up at middle school campus in Los Altos, California, and I'll be totally honest, maybe this isn't your experience, but sometimes kids were excited to see me. Sometimes they were not as excited to see me. And so then it's like my insecurity and my issues and honestly my own identity, belonging, and purpose journey. So like that's where it takes our resilience and our maturity and our centeredness in Jesus to be that wall.
Yeah, that's why I repeat in my car after I do contact work, I say, I will not let a 15-year-old determine my self-esteem.
Yes, exactly, totally.
I'm a child of God.
Totally, yeah.
Sometimes we need those affirmations. No, that's so good. I think that's a perfect segue to this next one. But there are real stressors that this generation, Gen Z and Gen Alpha even now, are facing. I mean, some that I think too often, unfortunately, we label them as fragile. I'd love to hear maybe Tanita, you talk a little bit about why do you think that is? Why is that our go-to? And where and how does the depression and anxiety that is very real, the loneliness that the research points to, especially around this generation, how does that factor in?
Well, if you listen to, but if you watch a lot of panels or discussions about folks who do generational study and study next generation, they will not use the word fragile. Okay, we have wiped that because it's not a great word. It's not an accurate description. Do we all have fragile moments? Yes. Yeah, catch me on day 3 here when I've been worshiping and poured into and I haven't slept at all and I've been overstimulated by all the people. I'm fragile at that moment, all right? But the thing is, we should not be speaking that kind of language or verbiage over our kids. What happens is we assume that everyone is operating at the same foundational level. We all have breaking points, right? Hungry, tired, stressed out. Sometimes it's a day, sometimes it's years. But we all have breaking points. We assume that we're all working from the same ground level, and then when we see someone hit the breaking point, we've made a judgment on how fragile they are instead of how much they were holding before they got to that point. Right? So we're operating down here. We've got a next generation that's holding stressors that are operating up here. So one more thing happens, they hit the breaking point, and everyone goes, oh, you're so fragile. Instead of recognizing they've been carrying an incredible amount of weight for a long distance, and this was just the one next thing. So instead of saying fragile, I say, no, they are incredibly strong and courageous, they are creative, and they are coping with a lot of stuff. So we can't make a judgment off of what we think an appropriate breaking point was, because if someone catches us on our bad day, they make that same call about us, right?
Oh, that's so good.
I'd be curious. I think this is interesting because the RELATE study, I'm trying to call it the RELATE study. The RELATE study actually has looked at 13 to 15-year-olds and compared stress levels with 16 to 18-year-olds. And, sometimes research sometimes confirms what we might have guessed, and that's great. Sometimes research surprises us, and that's great. So I want to do a little poll here, if that's okay. And this is globally. Globally, would you guess that 13 to 15-year-olds report greater level of stress and anxiety, or would you guess that 16 to 18-year-olds do? So kind of that younger adolescent or that later adolescent. How many of you would say 13 to 15-year-olds? Raise your hands. Okay, how many say 16 to 18-year-olds? Wow, we are pretty divided. Yeah, it's pretty split. It's actually 16 to 18-year-olds. So that older adolescent, probably needs a little TLC. And so for our 17-year-old 12th grader last night at 10 p.m., that looked like processing with her college and friendship and all as she's getting ready to graduate. So that was interesting to me in the Relate study that 16 to 18-year-old needs even more from us. So
would either of you, point to maybe a few things, tips and tricks around how do we combat that? How do we combat that depression, that anxiety, those stressors? And how do we, maybe more importantly, how do we help these generations move towards their potential?
Yeah, so we actually have a mnemonic for that. So it's a little corny, but it's ABCDE. Okay, so Fuller Seminary has the School of Psych, so we have a lot of mental health professionals who are our faculty, who are our alum. We interviewed them quite a bit in 2018, 2019, even before the pandemic, to try to understand how do we as caring adults, as leaders, as family members, how do we respond? And as we looked at what these wise mental health professionals came up with, we thought, okay, it really kind of spells out ABCDE. So A is we ask a young person on a scale of 1 to 10, how stressed or anxious are you? Ask that young person on a scale of 1 to 10. 1 to 4, probably not that big of a deal. Maybe 4, 5, and 6, we want to start paying more attention. 6 through 10 is probably when a young person needs some more support, some more accompaniment from us. And sometimes a young person might even have a hard time at giving a number for themselves. So sometimes if a young person's having a hard time, we might say, well, maybe you're about and we give a number and they can agree or disagree with that. So that question I find so helpful with teenagers and young adults. Ask. The B stands for breathe. How do we give young people physical, physiological, behavioral responses like how to breathe through feeling anxious? If you've ever been around a young person who's having an anxiety attack, they usually or often have a hard time breathing. So that's the B. The C is how do we help a young person center on a helpful truth or phrase or scripture verse? And, this is best if you've talked to a young person ahead of time, like, hey, if you feel anxious, what do you think might be helpful for you to remember? It's a little hard for them to maybe identify that scripture verse, that idea, that phrase, whatever it might be, in the midst of feeling anxious. So in our family, that's Emmanuel. Like our kids, if we know they're going to be stressed, we're often texting them Emmanuel, the idea that Jesus is with them. But how do we help them center on something? D is to help a young person develop a team. Life is not a solo sport, okay? And mental health is not a solo sport. So how do we help that young person identify, hey, in math class, that's when you often seem to get stressed. Is there a friend you can talk to about it? At soccer or whatever, is there an adult you can let know ahead of time that you tend to struggle in those kind of contexts? So we help them kind of identify who else. And then E, it's actually a double E. We empathize and empower. And I'm going to pull from Lisa DeMore here again. She has this great phrase when it comes to mental health, which is, that stinks, and I think you can handle it. And there's all sorts of variations like, wow, that is a lot that you're handling and, that you're trying to juggle. I think I'd be stressed too. What do you think you can do to handle it? Or what are some options you might have? Or how can I come alongside you? So, there's different ways that we might empower. It's not just saying, I think you can handle it. Sometimes we need to offer additional help or support or point people to mental health professionals. I'm a big fan of therapy for everybody, and especially young people who are navigating mental health challenges. So that ABCDE has been really helpful to a lot of adults who want to walk alongside young people.
I know this is like the Lisa DeMore fan club, but she also talks about that a full spectrum of emotions are normal and healthy. And I think for even me as a young life leader, I have to be comfortable with the negative emotions that kids have, that when they are sad and when they're angry, she talks about mental health isn't about feeling good all the time. It's about having the appropriate feelings for the appropriate circumstances and then effectively moving through those. And so how can I be comfortable with the emotions that we would label as negative and help our young people move through? Can I be comfortable with that for myself and help them move through that? Because that fullness of experiencing grief and heartache and rejection and hurt. Like all these will have emotional movements that I need to go through that. And that is actually part of our maturing so that we can walk through things in life and in faith.
So don't you think we need to be okay with those emotions in ourselves?
That's what I'm saying.
I mean,
yes.
I think that's kind of where it starts is,
Yeah.
Are we okay with our sadness, our pain, our grief? Are we willing to hold that with Jesus, with others we trust? And as we're more comfortable with that, we'll be a safer place for young people to do the same. So
We also mean we have to stop telling people they shouldn't feel like that, right? You know, we try to move people through, oh, you shouldn't be sad. Let's move through that really quickly. And that's because and then we think there's something wrong with us when we are feeling sad or we are feeling angry, instead of recognizing that's a normal emotional response to certain things. And we try to move people past it. And then now all of a sudden I have anxiety because I'm sad about something I should be sad about. So I think it's not being aware of for me and then not trying to fix you when you're feeling that way.
I know, talking to therapists too, that a lot of times young people get anxious about their anxiety. And that just kind of snowballs. So that normalizing it of anxiety, which I think is a little more common now that we're talking more about anxiety, that helps for sure.
So good. I mean, that's actually a great segue. The first question in this section from the audience, what's the most surprising thing that, the research found that traversed all cultures and generations? So we've talked a little bit about it, the kindness. That's a huge piece that I forget who it was, Kim, but somebody was talking a story about, they asked their kids. They took some of the findings and went back and asked their kids, and their kids, without telling them what we found, their kids say, yeah, I think I want to be known as kind. So that's a universal thing. That's not just American kids, U.S. kids. That's across the board in Africa and South America and in Europe. We're hearing that from this generation everywhere, that kindness, especially in the world that's wrought with division and polarization, is a huge, huge thing, and plays into some of those stressors. And then that window, that 16 to 18 window you talked about, again, you would think that, earlier in their formation, younger people are maybe struggling with, self-confidence and everything else. And actually the research says opposite. They're more confident when they're younger and when they know and have experienced less than by the time they get to that 16 to 18, later high school, preparing for college, and they start to reimagine or question, who am I? Where do I belong? What is my purpose? I mean, what does that mean for college? What does that mean for my commute? All of those things. So just, again, I'd point us back to those were two of some of the biggest findings that we heard. If Dr. Kim Nolan was up here, I'm sure she'd point more, but
I was surprised at 16 to 18. So if I had been voting, I would have been voting with the 13 to 15 be more stressful. And I do wonder if, again, thinking about this cohort of young people and their unique experiences, I think that older 16 to 18-year-old is a little bit more aware of FOMO, like the fear of missing out because of technology. They see all the options. I've heard a new alliteration similar to FOMO, which is FOBO, which is fear of better options, that I'm going to make a choice and then a better option's going to come along and, oh, shoot, I've already made my choice and I've missed out on this better option, which again, I think that 16 to 18-year-old is going to feel. So maybe I'm going to totally theorize here. I wouldn't be surprised if 10 or 20 years ago, pre-technology, 13 to 15-year-olds maybe were more anxious, but now it's shifting later. But that's just a musing.
No, that's so good. Maybe this next question, Tanita was trying to, again, help us figure out. So how do we respond in better ways to this generation, whether that's better answers, better conversations? I'm thinking about some of the stuff you've talked about, Kara. But specifically around stress, how do we respond in maybe new or healthy, better ways? And maybe what are some of the unhealthy ways that we don't realize are unhealthy?
Oh, for kids I mean,
adults responding to kids.
Adults responding to kids. Should we just say what the book is so people can just buy it?
Please,
there's
plug.
The Emotional Lives of Teenagers by Lisa D'Amour. She goes through all this kind of what's happening in the brain of adolescents, and then it's written for parents, but I really appreciate the verbiage that she really does give scripts like that stinks, but I think, you can do it. Or it took me a long time to realize that the way I responded to you was hurtful. And I needed some time to realize that. Would you please forgive me? So she gives a lot of verbiage for this, and also talks about how teenagers do cope with these different things they're dealing with. You know, one method is externalization, is I want to make you feel as bad as I feel right now. If I can externalize all my emotions and how I'm feeling and dump it onto you, what she says is actually proves that adolescent walks away and now feels like they can cope with what's going on and come up with a plan and move on. But mom and dad are like, oh no, I feel terrible now. And that was the goal. And that is a coping mechanism. And teenagers should have a number of coping mechanisms to go with. Now, as a young life leader, is that hard for me to take? Do I want to feel as bad as the kid in front of me? And how do I take that? How do I look at Jesus weeping at the tomb of Lazarus and figure out how do I engage with how they're feeling? But also not spiral out of control with my own emotional health at the same time, you know? And how do we teach young people how to cope with their stresses? Do we channel it into something else like, all right, we're gonna go to a demolition room and just gonna throw pumpkins, off the porch or whatever, like just do stuff to get the energy out? Are we gonna go for a walk, or we're gonna journal? Or we're gonna just be quiet in the car and turn on loud music and go driving for 10 minutes? But how do we, so part of it is, how are we helping them figure out what are the coping mechanisms so that they can move through how they're feeling, not stopping how they're feeling, but figure out how to move through how they're feeling.
Yeah, that's so good. But I think one of the things that you pointed out, but you also pointed out earlier, Kara, is like kind of starts with us. Just being aware of what are we bringing to the table. I love this next question. Somebody asked, do you feel some adults are too scared to get on a level with kids because of their own childhood trauma? Maybe stated slightly different, like, what do we bring to the table and how do we begin to work through that so that we can more effectively engage with adolescents, Gen Z and Gen Alpha? Kara, can I ask you?
Boy, that's a big question and a really good one. Y'all are asking
30-second question.
Y'all are asking great questions. I think you should try to stump Tanita from now on. Okay, can we just do that instead? I'm going to be a bit of a broken record here and go back to identity, belonging, and purpose. That just has become such a helpful compass for me when I think about how Jesus is transforming me. I think Jesus often has. Let me back up. I think we often have one of those three areas that is dominant for us in how we think and how we live, or maybe a struggle. And so for me, my biggest struggle is in identity. And I don't struggle with my identity as a leader, as a minister, as a teacher, as a researcher. I struggle with my identity as a mom and feeling like I'm not enough. I love how you said that a couple times, Tanita, how this generation, and maybe we can say all of us, wonder if we're enough. And I have 8 prayers I pray for myself on a mostly daily basis. And one of them is that I will know that Jesus makes me enough. And so, I would say as a general rule, the people who have the most to offer adolescents who are searching for identity, belonging, and purpose are those who are mindful and aware of their own identity, belonging, and purpose journeys. And that just helps us empathize, helps us be human. We don't need to emotionally vomit on young people by no means, but it just helps us be relatable, which is what young people are looking for. That's trust building, actually, when they know that we are in a journey, that Jesus is transforming us. That builds trust. So.
We're going to move to the final segment. Here we want to talk about what does it look like to minister to Gen Z. I'll throw in Gen Alpha as well, realizing that they're starting to enter into our middle schools, and Gen Z is quickly joining staff and there are volunteers. Maybe, Tanita, let me start with you, because your doctoral research was specifically about, how do we minister to Gen Z in this age and in this time? You both have talked about just their low trust for institutions and how that just becomes maybe an obstacle at times. And we're seeing why with moral failures and division. How can we, Young Life staff, but also broader church, model faith for this generation and overcome some of these obstacles, I'll say?
Yeah, the interesting thing about the low trust in institutions, and we've seen that it's trickled down now to personal relationships. So we have kids who don't believe when their friends say nice things about them, and think about that as a leader of going, how many times am I gonna have to repeat myself and saying something positive over and over again to this kid until they believe me or internalize it or balance around their head. This is a very slow work. Trust is built over, like you said, consistency, patterns of time. It's slow work. And so we have to be comfortable with that as leaders and as staff people working with kids, to know that it just takes time, and every kid is a little bit different. We talk about, this generation talks about being authentic. I think older generations would use the word integrity, meaning, are you who you say you are all the time? Are you integrated one way all the time? Like, who are you? Or do you just give me a picture of what we want me to see, and you're someone else behind closed doors or on a different account and things like that? And so the actual life-on-life ministry that we do, this relational walk, is incredible for showing what faith looks like. When kids are in my house and they're watching me parent and then try to cook dinner and try to get out the door, they see what my life looks like. They see how my relationship with Jesus isn't just me walking in the club and giving a club talk. It's relating with my husband. It's talking to my kids. It's taking care of the physical needs of my family. It's all the different things that are going on at the exact same time. But here's what I've realized about it that's been different in recent years than maybe my earlier years of being a young life leader, is that I have to now verbalize these things and connect the dots. It's because not all of our young people, because they've grown up with digital selves or hybrid selves or multiple selves, how you want to call it, there's different compartments going on in their brain. They're not saying, oh, I follow Jesus. That must connect all these things together now. And so now I'm having to verbalize it. And I realize I have a 6-year-old, almost 6-year-old tomorrow, and an 8-year-old. And I realize I have to verbalize things out loud for them too. And I use the same voice, and I sound, in my head, it's so cringy. Chuggy would be the other word, right? And I'm going, man, isn't it great how God gave me a fridge of food that I can cook dinner for you and my kids at the same time? And I realize that sounds very like Disney family, drive my kids to school. Isn't God great that he created the trees and the sun with, But these are things that internally I am grateful for, and I recognize God as our creator. But if I do not verbalize that, how are my young life kids and my own personal children supposed to make that connection? I have to make the concrete connection. So more and more, I am having to verbalize aspects of my faith in the practical, everyday monotony with my young life kids, whether it's how to drive my car or picking up, groceries, and verbalizing how does my faith in Jesus impact even the tiny little aspects of my life.
Kara, would you add anything?
Gosh, that's a great answer, Tanita. I'm just thinking about what I'm working on myself, kind of like you're saying. What I'm working on is a little different, and it's the statement we have from our research. It's, when it comes to young people, never make a statement if you can ask a question instead. So if I'm wanting to kind of get to a place in a conversation with a young person, it's tempting. I'm a direct person, and I'm an Enneagram 3. Okay, so I'm all about achieve, drive, accomplish, etc. And so it's just tempting for me to go for it. And I've learned that if I stop and think ahead of time, okay, what kind of conversation do I want to have? How do I actually make it a conversation where I'm asking good questions, and that we're unfolding something together instead of me making a handful of statements. So I give myself about a B- on that, but I'm working on that. Never make a statement if you can ask a question instead.
So good. We're coming to the end of our time, friends. This last question is, as youth workers, as young life leaders, area staff, staff associates, region, wherever we serve, this room is filled with a lot of different folks serving in a lot of different places. Burnout is real, especially as we face and step into the lives of these young people God is calling us to. How do we protect ourselves? What are some of the things that you are doing to protect yourself so that you can continue to show up, earn the right to be heard, step into the lives of kids and introduce them to Jesus and help them grow in their faith?
That's a pretty easy answer for me, because there's one obvious answer from the last 14 months now, is I have become legalistic about a 24-hour Sabbath. Over the last decades, I'd have Sunday afternoon as a Sabbath, or Saturdays sometimes, or whatever. And I'm a big football fan. I'm a big Chargers fan. Yeah. I like the shrug. That's pretty much how a lot of people respond to the Chargers. So I always say my two favorite teams are the Chargers and whoever's playing the Raiders. Okay, so those are my two favorites. See, there we go. Those are my two favorite teams. So, like a good Sunday afternoon, which had been a Sabbath for me, is like watch a game, take a nap. I watch football with my son, etc. Well, now I've extended it to 24 hours. And normally from Saturday at about 4 or 5 until Sunday at 4 or 5, I don't do work. I don't check email. I'll work on a family vacation, but I don't do work for my job and ministry, so to speak. I don't read ministry books. I read novels. What's amazing is I sleep in a little bit later on Sunday mornings. It's like my body, my soul know that. And it's helped me disengage from work more the other 6 days of the week and more when I'm on vacation. So Sabbath has just been game-changing for me. And I'm not normally a legalistic person, but on this, I've had to be legalistic. And God's been good. Great fruit from that.
So good.
Well, it's interesting. So I'm a young life leader and I live in my community, right? Am I ever not a young life leader, by the way? When I pick up my kids from school and when I go to the grocery store, and am I ever not a young life leader? And I think for some people it's very intimidating and it feels like a lot of pressure and a burden. If you really think about it, you can start to go, oh my gosh, my stomach hurts from that. I think the Eastern Church does a better job of integrating faith into every part of our life in very practical ways. Or if you look at some Celtic prayers, there's a prayer for everything. Because everything's supposed to be given unto God. And when I started learning and going, there's not a separation between the sacred and the secular, right? Between ministry Tanita and everyday Tanita, that it should be flowing from a place that's integrated and bound in who I am and who God designed me to be. So then living my life as someone who's in full-time ministry, it should be like breathing. I don't turn it on or off. It's just a part of who I am. Now, are there work things I put down? Are there times where I can tell I'm out of balance? Yeah, when that tipping point comes, I'm real cranky and I'm very direct and I don't care about anyone's feelings at that point. I'll just move on to whatever goal I have to accomplish. Or there's things that say, ooh, my breathing, I'm out of breath, or I'm breathing too hard, or I'm holding my breath. But the reality is it should be more like me breathing. There a couple books, our very own Dr. Sean McGeever, The Good News of Our Limits, incredible book, and it really is reminding you, who is God and who are you? Let God be God. That's his deal. You're not supposed to be God. So pay attention that you are created with limits, with human limits, and how do we live in those in a way that honors and blesses God? And there's also a book called The Imperfect Pastor by Dr. Zach Eswine, and his whole thing will say, really good ministry are small things done consistently over a long period of time. Not the big explosive, we did a club and 200 kids showed up and they all stood up at Say So the next week and that's 2 weeks of ministry. Can you believe what happened in 2 weeks? So it's the story of, I met this kid, we hung out over 8 years and here's what happened. Which I know that we don't want to face that. I got to do my donor ask. I got to do my year-end reports. And I'm terrified if all I have at the end of the table is I met with this kid once a week for a year. But here's the reality is all of our adults know that something has changed in our world. All the adults we work with are looking at this next generation going, we don't understand what's going on. But they care about it, which is why they know you. They want to know you care too. And so when we come up and we say, we know you know things have changed, we know things have changed. Let us tell you how we're adjusting because things have changed, and give our folks who are supporting us and with us the benefit of doubt that they also understand that a different pace has to be run.
Amen. Friends, I want to invite you as we close out this segment to do what we do best, which is our first work, and pray. I want to invite you to just take, who is that kid, that young person, that Gen Z, maybe that Gen Alpha, that is top of mind, or maybe that God brings to the top of mind. Just take a second around your tables, just 30 seconds to a minute, and just turn in and just pray. Pray out loud for them. You've heard a lot. You've learned a lot. What is God saying to you about them? And let's just fill this room with a little bit of that prayer right now. For just about 60 seconds, I'll close us, and then we'll segue to what's next. Can we do that? 60 seconds. Lord, we thank you because you hear our prayers. You invite us to pray, to bring to you our prayers and supplications. So, Lord, I pray that you would just hear and take all of these prayers, all the names, all the young people that we've just raised before you, and that you would begin to meet them at the point of their need. You would give each of us vision and passion and new energy to continue to pursue them as you are. And we just praise you in advance because you are up to something. We sense it, we see it, we feel it. So we thank you for this next generation and how you are running after them, inviting us to join you in that race. In Jesus' name, all God's people said, Amen. Can we just give Dr. Tanita Maddox and Dr. Kara Powell a rousing thank you? Young Life, we can do better than that. We do better than that. Thank you all for being with us.